Andy Warhol, the pop art legend, turned a can of soup into a creative icon. He was the exemplary American artist of the 20th century, a symbol of what many think of modern art today. In an unusual exhibition in Beijing named Becoming Andy Warhol, curators present over 400 works covering the artist's whole career, hoping to paint a new and retrospective picture of Andy Warhol for audiences in China and also America of his time. Particularly his story with the country China is being featured in some unique photos. In 1982, Andy Warhol visited China. He took his camera to sites including the Great Wall, the Tian'anmen Square, leaving some candid yet dynamic shoots that are also historic as they capture the country's transition through reform and opening up. I had a tour with Philip Tenari, the director of UCCA Center for Contemporary Art, where the exhibition is. These are the most well-known works.
Yes, this is a total breakthrough for Warhol when he started doing these in the early 1960s. I think a lot of people were quite confused because he was coming from this background where he was already a commercial illustrator, and then he decided to paint this everyday object, right, the soup can. Yeah. But I think he was always interested in, you know, the potential of the everyday commodity, right? How it made people's lives a little happier, what it might represent, and also I think most importantly, how it's this totally standard experience that people have across all different classes and races and ages, right? I mean, anyone, you've spent time in America, anyone who's lived in America has probably had Campbell's soup, even we don't think it's very good, but especially in the 1960s. I was
trying to read the flavors, by the way.
Yeah, it's very 60s. Hot dog bean. Right. Yeah, I don't know. Exactly. And there's these funny jokes like the manhandlers, like what is Scott's broth? I don't know, what does it even mean, right? But it's just, yeah.
It's just so 1960.
Totally. Yeah, and I think, you know, the idea that you could make art out of something that's so everyday was something that was really important to a lot of artists at that time. A few years ago in UCCA we did a show of Rauschenberg, you know, and he made paintings just using cardboard put up on the wall. This idea comes really from the artists of the early 20th century, people like Duchamp, you know, had this idea that anything can be art. But Warhol took that and ran with it to a new place, and he made it iconic. And
people didn't realize this is art until it is, right? I mean, he was not recognized with his style.
Yeah. Well, he was, because he was very successful as a commercial illustrator. This is a time in the history of advertising before photography was everything. So if you were launching a new product, you hired a painter to draw, you know, your shoe or whatever it was. And he figured out when he first arrived in New York in the late 40s, early 50s, how to make a lot of money doing this. I mean, he was making like, you know, equivalent of millions of dollars today just as a commercial artist. But he said at a certain point, that's not what I want to do. I want to be a real artist.
You know, when people look at this, what would they think about the 1960s America?
America at a different time, right? When a lot of people who are alive still had a memory of the Great Depression, the Second World War, you know, of times that were more difficult when there was scarcity. And so I think for some people this kind of packaged food, this packaged soup, you open it up and it's delicious.
Of course, this is the photo.
Yeah, no, this is I mean, people are pretty excited about this photo. It's
Tian'anmen Square.
Yeah, it's a great story. He came in 1982 in October. So towards the end of his life, right? He's highly established. And he's invited by a young entrepreneur in Hong Kong, and he's got some British friends, and he's got the other guy in the photo is called Christopher Makos, who he was like Warhol's official photographer at that time, went everywhere with him. You had these photographers based on the square with these big, you can see the movie actually, it's this big blue camera, and they take the photo and they print it out and they color it by hand. So anyway,
it was quite a funny process.
I mean, yeah.
And look at his face, also quite funny.
And I think it's interesting because actually, like when he was a child in Pittsburgh, actually this kind of photograph would be very common. But by the 80s in America, it was antique. But China is still using it then, you know. So it sort of really shows you the difference. And but I think he's also super excited to be in China because no one knew who he was.
No.
So he could walk around the streets full of people,
and
people just thought, oh, it's some foreign guy. And there's actually this great scene in the little movie of his trip to China. Finally, he's in the Forbidden City in the back garden, on the north side.
Yes.
And they run into some American tourists from Ohio or something, and they recognize him and take a picture together. But he really enjoyed this anonymity. This is actually, this work he made just a few months before he died in 1987. And I think what's interesting is you see this crazy wig. Actually, he wore a wig his whole life. He lost his hair very young. So most pictures you see, it's one wig or another. But by the end of his life, he's wearing what they call the fright wig, this crazy wig. And it's almost like he's become a caricature of himself, or like he's in costume all the time, right? And I think that connects to something really important about Warhol, which is that, in a way, his greatest work of art was himself. And I think this inspires a lot of artists. I mean, of course, everyone knows pop and some of the strategies of how to treat images and repetition and mass production. But actually, I think if you want to talk about his influence on modern and contemporary art, it's this idea that anything that the artist does can be art.
Right.
So his art is his paintings, it's his sculptures, but it's also his photos, it's also his films, it's also, in the late years he made TV shows, he produced record albums.
So how did that also have an impact on artists themselves? I mean, for a time, art is supposed to be art, to be away from commercialization as much as possible, but from him, it's like, we are one, and maybe the more the better.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a complicated legacy, right? Because I think once you introduce that idea, all kinds of different people pick up and run with it in good ways and bad. We even look at some popular artists today, like I don't know if you know Cause, who makes these they look like toys, is a child of Warhol. I mean, everyone's a child of Warhol in some way or another. But I think this kind of relationship between art and commerce is, by the time of his life, from the 60s to the 80s, it becomes inescapable.
Right. Is it easy to bring him over here?
We had great partners. The Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, which is the town he comes from, has the biggest collection of his work. And throughout this whole process, even with COVID and the curators and the couriers and all these professionals couldn't come, actually. The artist couldn't come because the artist is not alive.
Right.
But the museum people, unfortunately, couldn't come either. But it's interesting, the museum field is changing after COVID. We now, and because we're more conscious of the environment too. And normally for a show like this, you would have, 10 or 20 people coming to install, but this time we did it all ourselves. Some key pieces, like this one, we had them on Zoom, looking and watching to make sure it was handled properly, but it's forced us to grow in a really interesting.
The life of Andy Warhol is colorful, filled with creativity constantly drawn from daily life. His screen-printed images of soup cans, newspapers, and Coca-Cola bottles have made a new way of expression, pop art. What inspirations can we draw from the art icon in the times we live in? I joined Philip Tenari in a conversation with his counterpart of the exhibition, Patrick Moore, who's the director of the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, I'm joined by Patrick Moore, director of the Andy Warhol Museum, and in Beijing, Philip Tenari, director of UCCA Center for Contemporary Art. Gentlemen, welcome. Congratulations to this wonderful joint project. Tell me more about what kinds of ideas that you are trying to create in this exhibition about Andy Warhol and China.
So many people think about Andy Warhol and they think about Studio 54 and Marilyn Monroe and Campbell's soup cans. And those are iconic Warhol images and eras. But I'm here in Pittsburgh, which is a very industrial city in the United States, or at least it was when Andy Warhol was born here in the Great American Depression. So what we really want to portray is that Warhol was the son of immigrants to our country, that he came from a very kind of dirty and energized and rich city, but that he had a life before he went to New York City and before he became the glamorous Andy Warhol. He was the son of an immigrant family, the Warholas, and they didn't have money, they didn't have anything. So he was on a long trajectory to become Andy Warhol.
To you, Philip, what is it about, the exhibition?
In this exhibition, a viewer can see the illustrations he was doing in the 50s. One can see the work he did late in his life when he was completely established, and some people even thought it maybe past his prime. And you can also see things he did all along the way. You know, people don't realize a lot of the time that in addition to a painter, he was a very prominent experimental filmmaker. People might not know that he was an obsessive photographer who took a camera with him almost everywhere. And so all of these things are present in this exhibition.
I remember very well, Phil, that you showed me to the photo of Andy Warhol together with a photographer at the time working with him, standing in front of the Gate of Heavenly Peace, or Tian'anmen, Tian'anmen Square. And that has become an iconic moment also. Tell me more about how your audience is responding to that.
It's made in this way that would have been popular when he was a child in Pittsburgh, right? It's hand colored. And there's actually film footage of that photo being taken by a photographer on Tian'anmen Square with this big blue camera. And you can just imagine Warhol, you know, been taking photos all his life, you know, towards the end of his life, with his friend Christopher Makos, you know, in this place he'd never been, surrounded by people who actually don't even know who he is, being like an ordinary tourist, and then encountering this camera that's like probably similar to one he might have seen when he was a child, and getting this really kind of kitschy print, right? With this, the cheeks are red and the colors are bright yellow, and these different things. And I think it's just so much fun because for like a normal Chinese audience with some memory of this period of the 80s, they probably have photos like that at home as well. So it just creates all these different points of connection. And I think it gestures to this moment of him being in China, but you know, that's just one of the many, many things he did. So it's important that it's included.
Think about the time when he traveled to Beijing. China just reformed and opened up. Everybody in blue and green suits. Actually, he was also saying, I don't mind wearing blue. Actually, I enjoyed it. And he did almost every day, the same wardrobe, even when sleeping in the Beijing hotel. So Patrick, how do all of these stories resonate with your audience, their understanding about China, and also China through an artist's eyes?
We're very proud of Andy Warhol here in Pittsburgh. So the idea of presenting Warhol's work around the world, but particularly in China, is a great source of pride for all of us here, because we believe that Andy was the prototypical American artist, that he was an artist who really typified what it is to be an American, to be interested in fame and success, but also to have a deep history with his family. So I think for us, it's been this extraordinary thing to think of all of these new visitors in China getting to see Andy's work.
Right. Phil, artists are influenced and impacted by geopolitics and everything around them as well. How do you see, you know, a rediscovering, in a way, of Andy Warhol among your audience?
I think that at this time of rebalancing and rediscovery and reopening, it's important to try and go a little bit deeper. You know, there's been exchange between these countries and these cultures for, you know, since we're 50 years past Kissinger's visit, right? And 40 years past this Warhol's visit. But there's always more to discover and more to learn. And I think that's one thing that this show is able to do. This is not a show that's being down to its audience. And it's not a show that's trying to put some things in front of people and have them come and, you know, worship them or pay their respect. It's really trying to provide a very open platform for people to learn something about another time and place that is relevant to their time and their place, because there's so much in how Warhol saw himself and how he saw the world that's relevant, you know, to America today and to China today. Starting from, you know, his idea of himself as a medium, right, or as a media, you know, constantly framing, transmitting, positioning, performing. I mean, this is something we see from the visitors in the show. I think if Andy Warhol were alive and he saw, you know, the kinds of pictures people make in front of his works, I can't imagine he'd be anything but thrilled.
Let's move on about, you know, what art could mean to all of us. Andy Warhol being provocative, linking art with consumerism, being critical about that, but at the same time also becoming a pioneering figure in that. How do you see this combo in a way, Patrick?
I think that the reason that Warhol is so fascinating to people is that he lived through an era in the United States where America was a particularly exciting place to be, where different people of different social classes were meeting and making creative work together in this place, New York City. So for me, Warhol has always been a kind of magic portal into this time that I certainly wish that I could have been a part of. I would have loved to have been in New York
Yeah.
City in the 1960s, the 1970s. I actually was there in the 1980s. But I think that Warhol and artists in general are able to document things and to bring through the spirit of a time. And that really was a great time in the United States.
Chinese artists being impacted by Warhol because that's one of the earlier figures they got to know from the American contemporary art. But also at the same time, they're looking for their own languages. How do you see this absorbing and also trying to create from the Chinese contemporary art scene? How do you look back at the, trying to be original, of Warhol's time?
You can talk about Warhol's influence on global contemporary art,
Right.
on Chinese contemporary art in all kinds of ways. There's some very obvious ones, like in the 90s in China, there was actually a movement
Right.
where some artists, as China's market reforms were deepening, actually took like imagery from political posters in China from the 60s and 70s. His idea of performing the self and actualizing the self, and many artists in the years since then have taken up that project in different ways.
After talking about Warhol, what about the project cooperation between the two of you? How did that idea come into being? And I just want to know, how did you make it happen during the time when the pandemic is still one of the biggest challenges? Patrick?
What was particularly moving to me was the way that my staff at the Warhol worked with Phil's staff at the UCCA. They were very kind to one another. They really understood the challenges of doing an exhibition like this during the pandemic. And that really is a kind of example of what cultural exchange does. Two groups of people work together on a project to achieve something, and they come out of it with a really deep understanding of one another.
Yeah, this kind of collaboration is it's rare and it's precious and it's extremely valuable.
Phil, I know you and your staff have been doing some of the groundbreaking exhibitions, for example, of Picasso's show last year, and this time Andy Warhol. But because of the pandemic, the installation process will be very much a challenging process, because Patrick and his team will not be able to make it into Beijing. So, but every piece is so precious. And as a curator, you want to present it to in the best way to the audience, and for the sake of Patrick and his team's great work. So how is it done?
It's interesting because, of course, the pandemic has taught us a lot of lessons, and some of them are connected to other things. Like, for example, we've become more conscious of our carbon footprints, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is a global trend in museums, actually. I think a lot of museum leaders have decided that even if it's not so easy for people to travel, it's still so important for artworks to travel. And the artworks become almost like these emissaries of another time and place, which they already are. But the fact that people don't get to come with them almost makes it even more powerful.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of filling of the gap by different digital technologies. So all of the decisions about what goes where and how the show looks are basically made in a computer model. Before anyone's on site. Before we built the walls, we basically knew exactly the configuration things would hang on them. And then, as we're doing now, there's a whole process of Zoom from the site. You sort of change your schedule, 12 hours time difference, so that people from Pittsburgh can oversee, the unpacking and the hanging of some particularly valuable works. But it only is possible when there's a very high level of trust and collaboration between the people working.
Patrick Moore, Philip Tinari. Gentlemen, what a pleasure. The two curators, they made it happen, an unusual exhibition of Andy Warhol in China. For a man who said everyone would get 15 minutes of fame, Andy Warhol's legacy has lasted much longer. His works of art are still among the most sought-after items in the world today. That legend will likely to continue after you are hearing my conversation recently with some young curators and collectors from China. Let's listen in. Hi, everyone. Good to see you guys.
Hi, great having us.
This exhibition is amazing. Which work of his actually impressed you the most?
Yes, for me, I think it's the photography of him and Christopher Marcos in front of the Tian'anmen Square that was taken during his trip to China in 1982, I believe. Because I watched the Andy Warhol in China documentary that kind of, documented the whole trip to China, where there's a very funny kind of little tidbits from the trip. That he said when he was in Beijing, he kept asking for McDonald's, and back then McDonald's wasn't even existing. It was like 3 years after the reform and opening up.
And the Campbell soup can. Andy in Western culture so inspired one U.S. educated Chinese that he decided to share them with the Chinese people in an unusual way. Andy Warhol's trip to China was the dream of Alfred Hsu and Christopher Marcos, Andy's personal photographer.
Just think about one artist that's so much focusing on commercialization, right? Yeah. Into a country that has nothing to do almost with commercialization. It's amazing, isn't it?
It was totally, I guess, a new world for him and a new world for people who were interacting with him.
And also for you guys, I mean, you were born, most of you, after 1982, right? JJ, what about for you?
I love the ordinary Campbell soup. It has lots of flavors and, it makes people think about their food and their consumption.
What about for you, Neil?
Yeah, for me, I think that must be the Braille box, because since I study art history, so I think it's definitely amazing to be able to see the real, the work of art.
Is that having also an impact on Chinese contemporary artists? I'm sure they do.
Totally, because I think, back in the 80s and 70s, lots of Chinese contemporary artists, even like Xu Bing, like Huang Rui, like those artists are looking at lots of Western artists, their practice, like, Andy Warhol, like Rauschenberg, and their attitudes towards art, and also their relationship with, the areas that's normally considered as non-art. I think it's greatly shaped, Chinese contemporaries.
He influenced a very hot artist right now who also draws elements from mass and pop culture. He's called Wang Jianhuo. He Pikachu, Doraemon.
So the younger generation of Chinese artists, like in their 20s and 30s, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But to me it's also interesting how the youngest generation of Chinese artists today, how they are absorbing their life and how they are gather materials, getting inspirations. Where does it come from?
I think an artist has influence from the time that they're born, the age. Yes. The technology obviously made information more accessible to everybody, so artists are exposed to a variety of things that they previously weren't, which has pros and cons. I think it's much harder right now to be in the solitary creative zone that previous artists used to be. So more and more artists are, I guess, going the Andy Warhol path of trying to merge the secular world with art.
I like that. It's beautifully put. One of the things people look at the exhibition, and Andy Warhol, the person himself, is about the fact that how he has been able to jump out of his society, but still in the very middle of it, the commercialization itself. So how do you see that commercialization, the 1960 America, China today?
I agree with the notion that, like Neil mentioned, that artist as a profession was basically, or a superstar was basically created by Warhol. And you see that actually every day now in China and all over the world, in the art world nowadays, that artists are somehow equal to celebrities, especially when they have the crossover with like fashion brand, with high street brands. And also what you said about 2021 China, like the audience now seeing these 400 works and seeing how the commodity or the commercialization was heavily like kind of highlighted in Warhol's career. I think that really resonated with a lot of Chinese audience nowadays. And also the 15 minutes fame idea is now like we're surrounded by that every day with all the social media and everything. I think Warhol was really ahead of his time, and he really saw a lot of these things coming.
But are we having too commercialized it?
I think art and most other things are coming in a circle.
Oh, you think so? You're very philosophical. You should transfer to the philosophy department.
Art started with portraits and drawings, and then it developed into more abstract and complex and vague things with the movements like Cubism and Surrealism and this kind of stuff. Now it's going back to where it started, where it's things that everyone can relate to. I luckily got to meet some of the best contemporary artists in China today, and they draw very abstract things at the time, but there wasn't really a tax on it in the first, so there was this huge market boom with the auctions and the collectors, but I think it's still focused mainly on the West. If you're an artist, your goal is to get signed by a Western gallery, not a Chinese one. There's other commercial elements in the auction industry, of course.
But what you said is very interesting, the choice that artists have to make when it comes to commercialization.
Yeah, of course, totally. I mean, in terms of commercialization, in China, there's artists, they really open to working with different brand, doing all kinds of collaboration, but there are also, artists they can only working with, famous galleries. And there are also, some artists, they
just don't want to sign to anyone.
Exactly, and they just, make their work themselves. Yeah, I think maybe one of the most famous story will be, the American painter Agnes Martin invite his gallery, to pay his gallery, their owner come to her house and to destroy all her painting together. So I think that attitude still remains, in our society today.
The last question I want to ask, it really has, once again, going back to that photo, standing right in front of it, seeing Andy Warhol 1982 with the kind of interesting coloring on the face in front of the gate of heavenly peace still brings a very different feeling to me. So I'm really wondering, now the world is getting more complicated, it seems, than 10 years ago. I was just thinking, standing in front of the photo, what was the hope that people saw of his time? And facing that photo, what is the hope that we can still hold on to of our time?
We're in an age where different forms of art take place, and people are getting to know more and more. Even a few hundred years back, someone in China would have known an artist in Germany. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm still very optimistic about the future. Warhol says an artist is someone who creates things people don't need, but I think an artist is someone who creates things people need, but they don't know.
People exactly need, but they don't know, right? Yeah, nicely said.
I think that's a great photo. I think because the photo is actually exemplified something called, culture exchange. So I think that's...
It's not a cliche.
Exactly, it's not a cliche. And also, we can see Andy Warhol actually visited China. Like even today, we live in the age that we think we're more and more connected, but actually not. To be able to have a real culture exchange, you have to still go there and go see it with your own bare eyes.
I want to piggyback on Neil's statement of culture exchange. I think seeing that photo makes us realize, especially knowing the historical time point, it's after the opening, reform and opening up. It's after the Star Art movement. It's before '85 New Wave. We realized that arts and culture exchange wouldn't be stopped because of some outside forces. Like pandemic, being in the pandemic, we still are able to see these works that travel all the way thousands of miles and then put together by teams that are working together over the internet. And then these kind of things just make me really thankful, and then realize that a lot of works I actually have seen in the Whitney version of the Andy Warhol show, but it just makes me really miss this international traveling, and then realizing that art is just something that kind of brings us all closer together.
Right. Thank you so much. You guys are terrific. Thank you. I really appreciate it. an icon, an unusual exhibition, and a story about understanding through arts. And that's all we have for today. If you'd like to see more Search World Insight, check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.